Hello, everybody. So today we are going to get to some of the localized, if you will, like internal policies of the late 19th and early 20th century in Europe. So let's just get right to it. So Great Britain, and Great Britain had some general issues facing them at this time, and a lot of it revolved around labor. Trade unions and the Labor Party were really starting to force liberals in the government to try to alter some of their beliefs and actions because basically, we have some early reforms, but mainly it's like the British Parliament was like they kind of threw some things to workers early on, and they just basically stopped. Okay, socialism, communism really starting to kind of get popular, and strikes were becoming more and more prominent, which was really hurting industry because that hurts production. And a group that starts to come out to become very popular are the Fabian socialists, okay? And I have here the process. And these are socialists, and one of their main focuses is that we need to use the right to vote to capture the House of Commons. That's what it's really all about. And if you get that passed, you would then, or if you get members into the House of Commons, then you can get legislation passed that benefits workers. And real quick on the site, this is a place in London, and this is their symbol, kind of the wolf in sheep's clothing kind of a thing going on. They weren't in favor of Marxism, okay? So they're not full-blown communists. And the way they looked at socialism is like they want the changeover to occur, but they believe you need to obtain and still hold on to a democratic practice for that. All right. And then eventually what they're going to do is form what is known as the Labor Party, which still exists today. And they are going to increase, and by 1906 they'll have 26 members in the House of Commons, and you're starting to see a big push for these things. Now, the liberals in general are going to do some different things in order to try to focus their agenda, and as well as to prevent like crazy full-blown socialism. First and foremost, they will gain control of the House of Commons in 1906. But again, the big struggle they have is losing the working class vote. And so as a result, they start to enact some reforms. And the big guy was an orator and politician from Wales by the name of David Lloyd George. You see him there on the top left. And he becomes the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is basically the head of the Treasury. And what they're going to really do is get rid of a lot of aspects of the laissez-faire movement, which was in economics, which was really kind of the cornerstone of classic socialism, or classic economic liberalism. And one of the big things that they pass is the National Insurance Act of 1911. This will provide benefits for workers in case they're sick or unemployed, and it pays through a tax on your paychecks. But employers and the state also put money into it. It's very similar to many places today, as well as small pensions for retirees over the age of 70. And the way they do that is that they increase taxes on the wealthy. And that was actually really, really impactful. However, they do come head-to-head with the House of Lords on this. The House of Lords, again, is composed of hereditary aristocrats, and they will fight those plans, but liberals then pass a different law in 1911 that actually restricts the House of Lords' ability to impede legislation. And so what the House of Lords now becomes is more of an advisory group. Today they are able to introduce some types of legislation, and they do have certain things that they can block on the House of Commons, so a checks and balances thing. I'm not going to get into that. We'll talk about that later, but we're starting to see these things pick up in Europe, in Britain. And then the other thing was dealing with Ireland. In 1914, Ireland is finally granted home rule, but this is fought by Irish Protestants in Northern Ireland, mostly out of like Ulster County and areas around that, because they feel that if the Irish are given home rule, that Protestants might get discriminated upon, and they want Northern Ireland to still be part of the United Kingdom or / Great Britain, but not to be part of Ireland. And that is going to start to really pick up some steam. But then in 1914, World War I will put that on hold, and we'll get back to it. All right, moving into Italy, what's going on here? Well, Italy's going to struggle a little bit. So they do reach a period of stability under Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, but it's really done in kind of an underhanded way. What he did is embrace something they called of transformismo, or transformism, and this is a system in which old political groups were formed into new government positions, but in order to get stuff done, everything was basically bent on bribes. And so you took some of the old traditional people who have positions of power, brought them into this new kind of government, still a kingdom, but a constitutional monarchy type thing, but just everything was bent on corruption. And really, in general, they were ignoring a lot of issues like terrible work conditions, any types of taxation relief for the middle and lower classes, and it just wasn't going to last long. Until finally you start to get some big-time worker resistance. Post-1910, workers start to violently revolt. We're talking about massive protests, breaking shops, breaking stuff, strikes, fighting with local armed forces. Like, it's really, really bad. So Giolitti tries to mix it up. In 1912, he passes universal male suffrage. Cool. And also to try to increase nationalism, they will conquer Libya, which you see a picture of them on the left. So it's like, hey, we're conquering stuff and all men can vote. But the problem is that they really don't do anything to fix the economy. We're going to see strikes and strikes. We're going to see repeated use of federal troops to put strikes down. And World War I is not going to help things either. And some of these are basically going to open the door and establish some conditions that will eventually allow a guy like Benito Mussolini to come to power. All right, over to France. In France, one of the biggest things that actually occurred was the Dreyfus affair. And this is a really important moment. And I'm going to kind of give you some basics of it. You can look some stuff up. It's really, really fascinating. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish man and was a captain for the French General Staff. And he was found, quote unquote, guilty of selling army secrets to the Germans. And after that trial, he was sent to life in prison on Devil's Island, which you see some pictures of it there, off the coast of French Guiana. And Devil's Island is awful. It is a brutal prison. 75% of all the prisoners that ever went there died. And what's crazy is the prison actually stayed open and operational until 1953. But later on, evidence came to light that he was guilty, and it was actually a Catholic aristocrat by the name of Ferdinand Esterhazy, Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy, who's more known as Walsin, was actually the guy that did do this thing. But because he was Jewish, and this is a big push, because he was Jewish, the army actually refused to give him a second trial. Now, eventually, he's going to have to serve 5 years in that jail. He's finally given another trial, but he's found guilty again. And part of this is from anti-Semitic newspapers and other higher-ups that really started to push to push against him being released. Eventually, due to a variety of different authors, Emile Zola, who you see here, writes this letter called J'accuse, maybe? I'm sure somebody will correct me in class. That laid out the use of anti-Semitism, that laid out all of these things that shown that this was ridiculous, and eventually he is going to get pardoned and all charges were dropped. He gets his rank back, and eventually he will serve in World War I. However, this event splits the nation, which we'll talk about the impacts of it later, is that it's still struggling to be united, even though they created the Constitution in 1875. You basically had two camps. You had Dreyfusards on the left, and this is the letter from Emile Zola that appeared in newspapers. They are anti-clerical. They really want to focus on developing the Republic. They want more changes. Okay, they want this to be more democratic in France. On the right, you have the anti-Dreyfusards, who are really pro-church, they're really pro-military, and they yes, want a republic, but we need to keep the strength of our army, and again, against the traitors, because many people still call Dreyfus a traitor, even though all the evidence pointed to him not doing it. And as a result, you're going to end up getting a group of moderate Republicans that come to power that are going to make some moves. Most Catholic religious orders were actually removed from France, like the Jesuits and other groups, which is a really big deal since they actually ran most of the schools. Now the schools are going to be secular. All high-ranking officers that were seen as anti-Republican were actually removed, and they officially, by law, separate church and state. The state will no longer pay clerical salaries, and much of the church property was given to the government, and that was all done in 1905. But we're still going to have some industries or issues because they're lagging behind in industry. They don't do much for the rights of workers. A lot of their businesses were smaller scale. And so France is going to go through kind of another period of upheaval that will lead once again to World War I. Fun times. Germany. Okay, Germany at this time is a world power. Okay, they are the strongest industrial power on the continent. 50% of actually all German workers work in industry, and their urban centers and cities are growing as well. And the big party that kind of led all this was the Social Democrat Party, which was the largest party in the Reichstag. Not that there weren't any issues there. There were definitely some class concerns. The middle and lower classes wanted more opportunities and representation in the government, as well as they wanted the government process to change. Because remember, we're looking at a monarchy here and not a lot of voting going on. Wealthy business owners and government conservatives, on the other hand, are trying to fight it and make sure that that doesn't happen. And the big thing is that they're going to push expansionism, which what they will end up doing in Africa, to try to quell it and to increase unity. And the issue that we have that develops out of that is that an ultra-nationalist group is going to develop called the Pan-German League. They're going to push really hard for German nationalism. They're going to use imperialism as a tool to overcome class divisions. And the whole idea is to really try to expand German culture across the world. We're going to see some pretty horrible things that the Germans will do in places like Namibia, where you arguably have one of the first genocides of the 20th century. We will talk about that later in imperialism. And they are brutally anti-Semitic. This is just another wave against Jews. And so this aggressiveness is happening right on the eve of World War I, so this is going to be yet another factor. You see a theme I've got going on here. And then we have Austria-Hungary, and they're just barely holding on. What do we got in Austria? Okay, the Social Democrat and Christian Socialists are kind of on the rise, and they're big-time German nationalist parties. They are virulently anti-Semitic, and they are really cutting down on autonomy of nationalities. They think that's going to mess up their industrialization, and so they are becoming even harder core, limiting the rights of the Slovenes and the Slovaks and the Czechs and all those other people I've talked about over and over again. They are just coming down and really, really hard. Hungary is starting to play idea. Again, the Magyars are looking to maybe do a separation movement, but Emperor Francis Joseph, who still has power there, does threaten to give full male suffrage regardless of ethnicity in Hungary. So then Hungary would have to deal with some of the ethnicities that they have in their country. So they're going to step down, although the cracks are there. And again, post-World War II, we're going to see, World War I, I'm sorry, we'll see some changes. And then finally, we have Russia. And I have there the end is near because the end of the Russian Empire is coming close. Finally, we do get some industrialization led by their Minister of Finance, Sergei Witt. Or Witty. The big thing they do is massive railroad construction. They build 35,000 miles of railroad by the year 1900. Now, they're way behind, say, nations like the U.S., which is smaller geographically, but had 240,000 miles of railroads compared to the 35,000. But, you know, you got to start somewhere. And probably the biggest railroad is the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which linked Moscow and even up to St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. So there's Vladivostok and St. Petersburg. So we see super long, and we got all these different areas that spawn off it. It's 5,000 miles long. They're able to get all of these natural resources that they have in Central Asia out to the coastal areas for production and trade, so that's huge. They'll start to institute some protective tariffs, and they'll see steel and coal production rise, and it all seems it's going to go pretty good. But unfortunately, we have, not unfortunately, like unfortunately for them, if you will, the growth of the socialist party is getting bigger. Workers are starting to speak out more. A lot of people start, for the first time, advocating for the overthrow of the Tsar, who was Nicholas II at the time. But many of these people are prosecuted. Many are forced to leave Russia. That's going to be their big thing. Like, for instance, like a guy like Lenin, they get kicked out of Russia. So I guess that's better than them all getting killed, I guess. But they get kicked out, and so, but the rumblings are still there. And then we have the first kind of big blow to the Russians, which will be the Russo-Japanese War. Russia will go to war with Japan due to trying to influence and gain control over Korea. You see some propaganda pictures here. You see the Japanese one there with the Japanese imperial flag, right, going to victory. And then you see the Russians trying to kick out the Japanese here. So you have both propagandas on both sides. It does start on a surprise attack. Well, technically it starts on February 8th, 1904, when Japan does a surprise attack against Russia, and then you get the official declaration of war on February 9th, 1904. They're going to be fighting in Manchuria, which is part of northern China, as well as naval battles throughout the area around Korea and Japan. And Japan, I'm just going to keep it really simple. I mean, the Japanese smashed them. The kind of big culminating battle was the Battle of Tsushima Strait, in which the Russian Navy is completely obliterated by the Japanese. And in a way, this is actually a big wake-up call for the Europeans, because the Europeans really, they're expanding. They have lots of imperialism, which I've talked about already. But, this moment when a seemingly European power gets completely handled by an Asian power, it was not really expected. And this is, a big, coming out party for the Japanese as a world power. Now, eventually, you will get a treaty to end the war. That is the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was hosted by the United States of America. And Teddy Roosevelt was the guy that was really responsible for helping to bring the two sides together. He'd win a Nobel Peace Prize for that. And basically, Russia has to completely pull out of all of the areas and recognize that Korea and pretty much everything else in that northern area is under dominance of Japan. I mean, they do get to keep their railroads in the area, so that's cool, but this was a big blow to Russia. And it has dramatic impacts in Russia itself, with eventually the revolution of 1905. And basically, while that war was being fought, you had lots of unsatisfaction from the middle class and business owners and professionals who want more rights. Peasants have lack of land and rights as well. Laborers are dealing with horrible work conditions. And then over all of that, they're getting hammered by some nation that barely any of them even know about. And so on January 9th, 1905, there's a massive procession of workers that shows up outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. It is a peaceful demonstration that basically is broken up by troops, and hundreds of people are killed, and this becomes known as Bloody Sunday, which will be a rallying call for Russian forces in the future as well. But this does erupt in a full-scale revolution. Massive strikes, peasants will attack and burn the homes of landowners. Zemstvos are demanding that a parliament be created, and other ethnic groups, particularly in Asia, are going to start to rise up as well. And then in October, you have a full-blown general strike, okay, which means that all workers everywhere are like, we're done. So this is pretty huge. Excuse me. And Nicholas will finally have to respond, and he issues the October Manifesto. And in the October Manifesto, you have the creation of a legislative assembly known as the Duma, which is elected by a fairly large franchised group, so that was cool. And a Duma would be able to propose laws to Nicholas II and also try to have some influence in the finances. Um, and then also you're going to get some basic civil liberties like freedom of speech and things like that. But this really doesn't last very long. You're looking for really just a year or so, and it all seems to fall apart when this guy Peter Stolypin, who was an advisor to Nicholas II, who's there on the right, Peter's on the left, to create some agricultural changes, and really was working to try to get legislation through that would allow peasants to own their own land. But he gets assassinated. And when that happens, Nicholas, kind of much like Alexander III, with after Alexander II frees the serfs and then gets assassinated, and Alexander III's like, well, no, you can't have anything now. And then the same thing, we have this guy Peter Stolypin is trying to get some changes in. He's assassinated, so Nicholas is like, you know what, we're not going to do this. He starts to curtail the power of the Duma almost immediately, and then he'll use the army to actually just enforce and beat down everyone. And so we're seeing things start to spiral. The revolution is coming. World War I is also going to be a catastrophe for the Russians. And as you can see, some really tense situations going on in Europe, really adding to the pressure that will eventually result in the outbreak of World War I. All right, guys, so we'll talk about this class, and I'll see you soon.